What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, or there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared that we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. Huxley remarked, "The civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions." In 1984, Huxley added, "People are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure." In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. This book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. This is Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. In this book, Postman chronicles a transition that America is or has taken from a print-based literature culture toward a much more visual, television-based culture, and why this is not a positive development. Postman essentially tells a story of America starting from around the 1600s up to the current, which for Postman is the mid-1980s, but tells it through the lens of the history of various different kinds of media, from the printing press, printed books, pamphlets, newspapers, a telegraph, photograph, and television. However, Postman is not as concerned with the technological significance of these technologies and is more concerned with the impacts that they have on culture as a medium. How we are obliged to conduct such conversations will have the strongest possible influence on what ideas we can conveniently express, and what ideas are convenient to express inevitably become the important content of a culture. You cannot use smoke to do philosophy. Its form excludes content. This book is an inquiry into and a lamentation about the most significant cultural fact of the second half of the 20th century, the decline of the age of typography and the ascendancy of the age of television. This changeover has dramatically and irreversibly shifted the content and meaning of public discourse, since two media so vastly different cannot accommodate the same ideas. As the influence of print wanes, content of politics, religion, education, and everything else that comprises public business must change and be recast in terms that are most suitable to television. Our media are our metaphors. Our metaphors create the content of our culture. Truth does not and never has come unadorned. It must appear in its proper clothing, or it is not acknowledged, which is a way of saying that the truth is a kind of cultural prejudice. Epistemology is, in a sense, the clothing truth is dressed with. Our conception of what feels true or what we expect truth to look like is in no small way shaped by the epistemological fashions of our age. I raise no objection to television's junk. The best thing on television are its junk, and no one is seriously threatened by it. Besides, we do not measure a culture by its output of undisguised trivialities, but what it claims as significant. What will likely be a surprise to some, the author is not opposed to the junk found on television. Nobody, not even the creators of junk TV, will likely view their work with much importance. What is important, however, is what a culture claims as significant. We are accustomed to thinking of rhetoric as an ornament of speech, most often pretentious, superficial, and unnecessary. But to the people who invented it, rhetoric was not merely an opportunity for dramatic performance, but a near indispensable means of organizing evidence and proofs, and therefore of communicating truth. In Socrates' day, rhetoric was the preeminent epistemological fashion that truth was expected to take. Failing to attend to this fashion cost Socrates his life. Rhetoric was the proper means through which right opinion was to be both discovered and articulated. To disdain rhetorical rules, to speak one's thought in a random manner, without proper emphasis or appropriate passion, was considered demeaning to the audience, intelligent, and suggestive of falsehood. Seeing is believing has always had a preeminent status as an epistemological axiom, but saying is believing, reading is believing, counting is believing, deducing is believing, and feeling is believing are others that have risen and fallen in importance as cultures have undergone media change. Since intelligence is primarily defined as one's capacity to grasp the truth of things, it follows that what a culture means by intelligence is derived from the character of its important forms of communication. Just as different media impose different expressions of truth, this also implies different expressions of stupidity. If you cannot attend to the physical demands of reading a book, our culture may label you as anything from hyperkinetic to undisciplined, in any case as suffering from some sort of intellectual deficiency. The printing press makes rather stringent demands on our bodies as well as our minds. Controlling your body is, however, only a minimal requirement. You must have learned to pay no attention to the shapes of the letters on a page. You must see through them, so to speak, so that you can go directly to the meaning of the words they form. If you are preoccupied with the shapes of the letters, you will be an intolerably inefficient reader, likely to be thought stupid. To be able to do these things and more constitutes a primary definition of intelligence in a culture whose notions of truth are organized around the printed word. A major new medium changes the structure of discourse. It does so by encouraging certain uses of the intellect, by favoring certain definitions of intelligence and wisdom. New mediums do not necessarily imply progress or regression, but are exchanges. But not all exchanges are equal in proportion. We must be careful in praising or condemning, because the future may hold surprises for us. The invention of the printing press itself is a paradigmatic example. Typography fostered the modern idea of individuality, but it destroyed the medieval sense of community and integration. Typography created prose but made poetry into an exotic and elitist form of expression. Typography made modern science possible but transformed religious sensibility into mere superstition. Typography assisted in the growth of the nation-state, but thereby made patriotism into a sordid, if not lethal, emotion. The American colonies were a strikingly literate society from the beginning. This is partially due to the religious convictions of these early colonists. Between 1640 and 1700, the literacy rate for men in Massachusetts and Connecticut was somewhere between 89 and 95%, quite possibly the highest concentration of literate males to be found anywhere in the world at that time. It is to be understood that the Bible was the central reading matter in all households, where these people were Protestants who shared Luther's belief that the printing press was God's highest and extremest act of grace, whereby the business of the gospel is driven forward. The male literacy rate in 17th century England did not exceed 40%. The founding fathers were sages, scientists, men of broad cultivation, many of them apt in classical learning, who used their wide reading in history, politics, and law to solve exigent problems of their time. The impact of a culture surrounded by the written word was not limited to how people wrote, but how people thought and spoke. Postman recounts a debate between Lincoln and Douglas taking place under a tent and no small crowd to hear them debate, a debate lasting nearly 7 hours long. Two men who were not even running for any public office at that time, and this was not an uncommon scene. The use of language as a means of complex argument was an important, pleasurable, and common form of discourse in almost every public arena. Both the speakers and their audience were habituated to a kind of oratory that may be described as literary. For all the hoopla and socializing surrounding the event, speakers had little, and the audiences little to expect, but language. And the language that was offered was clearly modeled on the style of the written word. This kind of debate would be totally unrecognizable, if not grossly unappetizing to any television audience. Today, Douglas' strategy would be widely seen as suicidal in foregoing an emotional appeal as far as the debate is concerned. Douglas claimed that his appeal was to understanding and not to passion, as if the audience would be silent, reflective readers in his language, the text from which they must ponder. Which brings us, of course, to the questions. What are the implications for public discourse of a written or typographic metaphor? What is the character of its content? What does it demand of the public? What uses of the mind does it favor? A written sentence calls upon its author to say something, upon its reader to know the import of what is said. And when an author and a reader are struggling with semantic meaning, they are engaged in the most serious challenge to the intellect. This is especially the case with the act of reading. To be confronted by the cold abstractions of printed sentences is to look upon language bare, without the assistance of either beauty or community. Thus, reading is by nature a serious business. It is also, of course, an essentially rational activity. That the sequential, propositional character of the written word fosters what Walter Ong calls the analytic management of knowledge. To engage the written word means to follow a line of thought which requires considerable powers of classifying, inference-making, and reasoning. It means to uncover lies, confusions, and overgeneralizations, to detect abuses of logic and common sense. It also means to weigh ideas, to compare and contrast assertions, to connect one generalization to another. To accomplish this, one must achieve a certain distance from the words themselves, which is, in fact, encouraged by the isolated and impersonal text. That is why a good reader does not cheer an apt sentence or pause to applaud even an inspired paragraph. Analytic thought is too busy for that, and too detached. In a culture dominated by print, public discourse tends to be characterized by coherent, orderly arrangement of facts and ideas. So what was the legacy of this culture dominated by print? What are some of its byproducts? For one, it produced Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason. It also produced the system of higher education as we know it today. In The Age of Reason, Paine attacked the Bible and all subsequent Christian theology. All national institutions of churches, he wrote, whether Jewish, Christian, or Turkish, appear to me no other than human inventions, set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit. It is sometimes forgotten that the churches in America laid the foundation of our system of higher education. Harvard, of course, was established early, in 1636, for the purpose of providing learned ministers to the Congregational Church. And 65 years later, when Congregationalists quarreled among themselves over doctrine, Yale College was founded to correct the lax influence of Harvard, and to this day claims it has the same burden. The strong intellectual strain of the Congregationalists was matched by other denominations, certainly in their passion for starting colleges. The Presbyterians founded, among other schools, the University of Tennessee, Washington, and Jefferson, and Lafayette. The Baptists founded, among others, Colgate, George Washington, Furman, Denison, and Wake Forest. The Episcopalians founded Hobart, Trinity, and Kenyon. The Methodists founded 8 colleges between 1830 and 1851, including Wesleyan, Emory, and DePaul. In addition to Harvard and Yale, the Congregationalists founded Williams, Middlebury, Amherst, and Oberlin. Higher education was built by largely Protestant denominations, by people who took not just the reading of God's Word seriously, but read generally with seriousness. In the 18th and 19th centuries, religious thought and institutions in America were dominated by an austere, learned, and intellectual form of discourse that is largely absent from religious life today. No clearer example of the difference between earlier and modern forms of public discourse can be found than in the contrast between the theological arguments of Jonathan Edwards and those of, say, Jerry Falwell or Billy Graham. The modern idea of testing a reader's comprehension as distinct from something else a reader may be doing would have seemed an absurdity in 1790 or 1830 or 1860. What else was reading but comprehending? Almost all the characteristics we associate with mature discourse were amplified by typography, which has the strongest possible bias towards exposition, a sophisticated ability to think conceptually, deductively, and sequentially, a large capacity for detachment and objectivity, and a tolerance for delayed response. The telegraph and photograph in the mid-1800s was the dawn of a new age, and the beginning of the end of the age of typography. The telegraph was an information revolution that changed not only how information was communicated, but what information was understood to be. The telegraph destroyed the prevailing definition of information, and in doing so gave a new meaning to public discourse. Among the few who understood this consequence was Henry David Thoreau, who remarked, "We are in great haste to construct a magnetic telegraph from Maine to Texas, but Maine and Texas, it may be, have nothing important to communicate. We are eager to tunnel under the Atlantic and bring the old world some weeks nearer to the new. But, perchance, the first news that will leak through into the broad flapping American ear will be that Princess Adelaide has the whooping cough." The telegraph made information into a commodity, a thing that could be bought and sold irrespective of its uses or meaning. Newspapers would be quickly filled with this new commodity. James Bennett of the New York Herald boasted that in the first weeks of 1848, his paper contained 79,000 words of telegraphic content. Of what relevance to his readers, he didn't say. Only 4 years after Morse opened the nation's first telegraph line, the Associated Press was founded, and news from nowhere, addressed to no one in particular, began to crisscross the nation. Wars, crimes, crashes, fires, floods, much of it the social and political equivalent of Adelaide's whooping cough, became the content of what people call the news of the day. The very concept of a newspaper filled with the news of the day as a commodity is the telegraph's greatest legacy that continues today. The principal strength of the telegraph was its capacity to move information, not collect it, explain it, or analyze it. In this respect, telegraphy was the exact opposite of typography. A book is an attempt to make thought permanent and to contribute to the great conversation conducted by authors of the past. Therefore, civilized people everywhere considered the burning of a book a vile form of anti-intellectualism, but the telegraph demands that we burn its contents. Around this time, the technological problems of photography were being solved and being employed for commercial use in newspapers. A picture may be worth 1,000 words, but there are words that no picture can express. There are concepts that no picture is capable of expositing. And just as nature and the sea cannot be photographed, such larger abstractions as truth, honor, love, falsehood cannot be talked about in the lexicon of pictures. But there is no such thing as a photograph taken out of context, for a photograph does not require one. In fact, the point of photography is to isolate images from context so as to make them visible in a different way. So what are we to do with this glut of information pouring in from every corner of the world through newspapers and telegraphs? What did people actually do with so much information that had little impact on their daily lives? Where people once sought information to manage the real context of their lives, now they had to invent contexts in which otherwise useless information might be put to some apparent use. The crossword puzzle is one such pseudo-context. The cocktail party is another. Enter the pseudo-context, perhaps one of my favorite terms in this book. Beneath its dying melody, a new note had been sounded, and photography and telegraphy set the key. Theirs was a language that denied interconnectedness, proceeded without context, argued the irrelevance of history, explained nothing, and offered fascination in place of complexity and coherence. Theirs was a duet of image and instancy, and together they played the tune of a new kind of public discourse in America. Together, this ensemble of electronic techniques called into being a new world, a peekaboo world, where now this event, now that, pops into view for a moment, then vanishes again, in a world without much coherence or sense, a world that does not ask us, indeed does not permit us to do anything, a world that is, like the child's game of peekaboo, entirely self-contained, but like peekaboo, it is also endlessly entertaining. This world that Postman depicts is perhaps more recognizable to today's generation in 2025 than in 1985. What might have been true in 1985 is exponentially more so in 2025, making Postman's observations quite prescient. All this before the introduction and adoption of the television. There is no audience so young that it is barred from television. There is no poverty so abject that it must forego television. There is no education so exalted that it is not modified by television. And most important of all, there is no subject of public interest, politics, news, education, religion, science, sports, that does not find its way to television, which means that all public understanding of these subjects is shaped by the biases of television. 20 years ago, the question, does television shape culture or merely reflect it, held considerable interest for many scholars and social critics. The question has largely disappeared as television has gradually become our culture. Television speaks in only one persistent voice, the voice of entertainment. Each technology has an agenda of its own. It is, as I have suggested, a metaphor waiting to unfold. The printing press, for example, had a clear bias toward being used as a linguistic medium. It is conceivable to use it exclusively for the reproduction of pictures, and one imagines the Roman Catholic Church would not have objected to its being so used in the 16th century. Had that been the case, the Protestant Reformation might not have occurred. Thus, in answering the question, what is television, we must understand, as a first point, that we are not talking about television as a technology, but television as a medium. The impact of the television has not been small. Neither are the demands of its biases and its irrevocable bend towards entertainment. But what I am claiming here is not that television is entertaining, but it has made entertainment itself the natural format for the representation of all experience. The problem is not that television presents us with entertaining subject matter, but that all subject matter is presented as entertaining, which is another issue altogether. To say it still another way, entertainment is the super-ideology of all discourse on television. No matter what is depicted or from what point of view, the overarching presumption is that it is there for our amusement and our pleasure. It is in the nature of the medium that it must suppress the content of ideas in order to accommodate the requirements of visual interest, that is to say, to accommodate the values of show business. It would be one thing if this influence was merely constrained to the subject and presentation of much of the content on television, but this influence was not constrained. It is not merely that on the television screen entertainment is a metaphor for all discourse. It is that off the screen, the same metaphor prevails. As typography once dictated the style of conducting politics, religion, business, education, law, and other important social matters, television now takes command. In courtrooms, classrooms, in operating rooms, war rooms, churches, and even airplanes, Americans no longer talk to each other. They entertain each other. They do not exchange ideas. They exchange images. They do not argue with propositions. They argue with good looks, celebrities, and commercials. For the message of television as metaphor is not only that all the world is a stage, but that the stage is located in Las Vegas, Nevada. Our priests and presidents, our surgeons and lawyers, our educators and newscasters need worry less about satisfying the demands of their discipline than the demands of good showmanship. Television did not invent the now-this worldview. As I have tried to show, it is the offspring of the intercourse between telegraphy and photography, but it is through television that it has been nurtured and brought to a perverse maturity. Viewers are rarely required to carry over any thought or feeling from one parcel of time to another. That the perception of the truth of a report rests heavily upon the acceptability of the newscaster. Within the medium of television, so much of the nonverbal and aesthetic cues will ultimately take precedence over and against any propositional and objective content. I should go so far as to say that embedded in the surrealistic frame of a television news show is a theory of anti-communication, featuring a type of discourse that abandons logic, reason, sequence, and rules of contradiction. In aesthetics, I believe the name given to this is deism. In philosophy, nihilism. In psychiatry, schizophrenia. In the parlance of the theater, it is known as vaudeville. It is not just aesthetics, but the fact that such conversations take place within the context of a scheduled broadcast package, chopped up to accommodate the commercialization of such conversations, will inevitably lead to a program designed to accommodate itself to the demands of television. For television will not accommodate itself to productive, constructive, comprehensive, coherent conversations. Indeed, it cannot. The idea, Robert McNeil writes, is to keep everything brief, not to strain the attention of anyone, but instead to provide constant stimulation through variety, novelty, action, and movement. You are required to pay attention to no concept, no character, and no problem for more than a few seconds at a time. He goes on to say that the assumptions controlling a news show are that bite-sized is best, that complexity must be avoided, that nuances are dispensable, that qualifications impede the simple message, that visual stimulation is a substitute for thought, and that verbal precision is an anachronism. If you were a producer of a television news show for a commercial station, you would not have the option of defying television's requirements. It will be demanded of you that you strive for the largest possible audience, and as a consequence, and in spite of your best intentions, you would arrive at a production very nearly resembling McNeil's description. The result of all this is that Americans are the best entertained and quite possibly the least well-informed people in the Western world. All that is left to express are things that satisfies the demands of television, which is ultimately cacophonous, incoherent, disconnected, but entertaining, and therefore can be commercialized. What is happening here is that television is altering the meaning of being informed by creating a species of information that might properly be called disinformation. I'm using this word almost in the precise sense in which it is used by spies in the CIA or KGB. Disinformation does not mean false information. It means misleading information, misplaced, irrelevant, fragmented, or superficial information. Information that creates the illusion of knowing something, but which in fact leads one away from knowing. We are losing our sense of what it means to be well-informed. Ignorance is always correctable, but what shall we do if we take ignorance to be knowledge? The situation is confounding to those who are aware and potentially destructive to those who aren't. It would certainly appear as though this were a grand conspiracy if it were not for the immense appetite for entertainment. The president does not have the press under his thumb. The New York Times and the Washington Post are not Pravda. The Associated Press is not TASS. And there is not newspeak here. Lies have not been defined as truth, nor truth as lies. All that has happened is that the public has adjusted to incoherence and has been amused into indifference. Huxley grasped, as Orwell did not, that it is not necessary to conceal anything from a public insensible to contradiction and narcoticized by technological diversions. In presenting news to us packaged as vaudeville, television induces other media to do the same, so that the total information environment begins to mirror television. Whereas television taught the magazines that news is nothing but entertainment, the magazines have taught television that nothing but entertainment is news. If there is one category of people who are not uniformly inclined to consider the detrimental, if not corrupting influence of television, it will be the churches and sects of various other Christian ministries that have undergone televising their sermons for public consumption. Of the less theologically astute organizations, the 700 Club includes taped reenactments of people who have been driven to the edge of despair, are saved by the 700 Club. Such people play themselves in these finely crafted docudramas. And so we might say that the 700 Club has twice elevated her to a state of transcendence. First by putting her in the presence of Jesus, second by making her into a television star. To the uninitiated, it is not entirely clear which is the higher estate. Television, with its ostensibly visual nature, puts undue emphasis on the visual preacher, for it is difficult indeed to televise an invisible God. The medium of television makes idolatry a continual hazard. On these shows, the preacher is tops, God comes out second banana. The principles and priorities of television absolutely will have its way. The priorities of higher viewership and good showmanship will inevitably become the preacher's priorities, and will be confused as being the fruits of a successful ministry, when such metrics inevitably arise. Television favors moods of conciliation and is at its best when substance of any kind is muted. Theological substance and faithful expository preaching will always be the first casualty on the road to higher ratings and viewership. Indeed, I think it is fair to say that attracting an audience is the main goal of these programs, just as it is for the A-Team and Dallas. It is most alluring when it speaks the language of dynamic visual imagery. It does not accommodate complex language or stringent demands. As a consequence, what is preached on television is not anything like Sermon on the Mount. Religious programs are filled with good cheer. They celebrate affluence. Their featured players become celebrities. Though their messages are trivial, the shows have high ratings. Or rather, because their messages are trivial, the shows have high ratings. Most Americans, including preachers, have difficulty accepting the truth, if they think about it at all, that not all forms of discourse can be converted from one medium to another. It is naive to suppose that something that has been expressed in one form can be expressed in another without significantly changing its meaning, texture, or value. Much prose translates fairly well from one language to another, but we know that poetry does not. Though it may be un-American to say it, not everything is televisable, or to put it more precisely, what is televised is transformed from what it was to something else, which may or may not preserve its former essence. For the most part, television preachers have not seriously addressed this matter. They have assumed that what had formerly been done in a church or a tent and face-to-face can be done on television without loss of meaning, without changing the quality of the religious experience. Perhaps their failure to address this translation issue has its origin in the hubris engendered by the dazzling number of people to whom television gives them access. Some of the more popular preachers are quite willing to go head-to-head with secular programs because they believe they can put on a more appealing show. To achieve this goal, the most modern methods of marketing and promotion are abundantly used, such as offering free pamphlets, Bibles, and gifts, and in Jerry Falwell's case, 2 free Jesus First pins. The preachers are forthright about how they control the content of their preaching to maximize their ratings. This temptation to believe, if in a small way, that preachers can do God's work, apart from God and through our own devices and resources, makes television quite an insidious temptation. I believe I am not mistaken in saying Christianity is a demanding and serious religion. When it is delivered as easy and amusing, it is another kind of religion altogether. If politics were like a sporting event, there would be several virtues to attach to its name: clarity, honesty, and excellence. But what virtues attach to politics if Ronald Reagan is right when he says politics is just like show business? Show business is not entirely without an idea of excellence, but its main business is to please the crowd, and its principal instrument is artifice. If politics is like show business, then the idea is not to pursue excellence, clarity, honesty, but to appear as if you are, which is another matter altogether. And what the other matter is can be expressed in one word: advertising. What the advertiser needs to know is not what is right about the product, but what is wrong about the buyer. And so the balance of business expenditures shifts from product research to market research. The television commercial has oriented business away from making products of value and towards making consumers feel valuable, which means that the business of business has now become pseudo-therapy. This is a brash and startling structure for communication since, as I remarked earlier, the commercial always addresses itself to the psychological needs of the viewer. Thus it is not merely therapy, it is instant therapy. Among those lessons are that short and simple messages are preferable to long and complex ones, that drama is to be preferred over exposition, that being sold solutions is better than being confronted with questions about problems. For example, a person who has seen 1 million television commercials might well believe that all political problems have fast solutions through simple measures, or ought to. We are not permitted to know who is best at being president or governor or senator, but whose image is best in touching and soothing the deep reaches of our discontent. What I am saying is that just as the television commercial empties itself of authentic product information so that it can do its psychological work, image politics empties itself of authentic political substance for the same reason. Our Ministry of Culture is Huxleyan, not Orwellian. It does everything possible to encourage us to watch continuously, but what we watch is a medium which presents information in a form that renders it simplistic, non-substantive, non-historical, non-contextual, that is to say, information packaged as entertainment. In America, we are never denied the opportunity to amuse ourselves. Censorship, after all, is a tribute tyrants pay to the assumption that a public knows the difference between serious discourse and entertainment, and cares. How delighted would be all the kings, czars, and fuhrs of the past, and commissars of the present, to know that censorship is not a necessity when all political discourse takes the form of a jest. The classroom, tragically, has not escaped television's influence, nor are the full-scale assaults against the classroom, in the form of the likes of Sesame Street, seen as such, especially by the creators. We can hardly expect those who want to make good television shows to concern themselves with what the classroom is for. They are concerned with what television is for. Sesame Street does not encourage children to love school or anything about school. It encourages them to love television. That is why I think it is accurate to call television a curriculum. As I understand the word, a curriculum is a specially constructed information system whose purpose is to influence, teach, train, or cultivate the mind and character of youth. Television, of course, does exactly that, and does it relentlessly. I refer first to the fact that television's principal contribution to educational philosophy is the idea that teaching and entertainment are inseparable. Education philosophers have argued that there must be a sequence to learning, that perseverance and a certain measure of perspiration are indispensable, that individual pleasures must frequently be submerged in the interest of group cohesion, and that learning to be critical and to think conceptually and rigorously do not come easily to the young, but are hard-fought victories. Indeed, Cicero remarked that the purpose of education is to free the student from the tyranny of the present, which cannot be pleasurable for those, like the young, who are struggling hard to do the opposite, that is, accommodate themselves to the present. The name we may properly give to an education without prerequisites, perplexity, and exposition is entertainment. The consequences of this reorientation are to be observed not only in the decline of the potency of the classroom, but paradoxically in the refashioning of the classroom into a place where both teaching and learning are intended to be vastly amusing activities. This push was done initially under the belief that television education was just as, if not more effective than, traditional curriculum, but this is something that reputable studies have rejected. So far as many reputable studies are concerned, television viewing does not significantly increase learning, is inferior to, and less likely than print to cultivate higher order inferential thinking. But what is happening here is that the content of the school curriculum is being determined by the character of television, and even worse, that character is apparently not included as part of what is studied. One would have thought that the school is the proper place for students to inquire into the ways in which media of all kinds, including television, shape people's attitudes and perceptions. Mainly, they will have learned that learning is a form of entertainment, or more precisely, that anything worth learning can take the form of entertainment, and ought to. This is without a doubt one of my favorite books. If I could share every highlight or anything I want to share out of this book, I would be producing an audiobook. All in all, just phenomenal foresight and cultural analysis. This is a book that seems to age in reverse, whereas many other books would have a tendency to age less gracefully. Again, this is a very approachable book. This is one of those seemingly evergreen books, and hopefully spawns many productive conversations and questions. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.